This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Sheela Hobden, and I am an executive coach and research practitioner. And in this new series, I'm delighted to introduce you to fellow coaches and researchers who share my passion for the transformative potential of research in coaching. Through curious conversations and practical insights, this series aims to inspire coaches to embrace evidence-based practices and enrich their professional journey. Hello, and welcome to this new edition of this podcast that I am hosting on research in coaching. I'm delighted today to be joined by Jeremy Lewis, who is a coaching supervisor who runs a practice called Grow the Coach, the clues in the name. He's also a practitioner-researcher, or I've also heard the term pracademic. He first started his research in 2021. It was published in 2023, and there is more coming this year. So hello, Jeremy.
Hello, Sheila. Thanks for having me.
And I think the other thing I wanted to say is that we've talked with other guests previously about how one way to get into people's research is if someone's written a piece of research that you're interested in, to get in touch with the person that wrote it and go from there. And Jeremy, you are a real live example of that. I found your paper on coach supervision and we had a conversation, and here we are today. So just bringing that tip to life. So I'll start off by asking you, what made you say yes when I put out the invitation to join?
It's a great question. I am delighted to be here. I think when we first spoke about research, and of course we're both supervisors, so we had a lot in common chatting around everything that we were up to. I'd just come off a presentation, or relatively recently off a presentation by David Clutterbuck, and he was talking about evidence-based practice. One of the things he talked about was really challenging ourselves in our coaching practice about the models and tools that we use, and whether they are just someone's opinion or whether they're based on evidence. And it got me thinking, because I'd already been researching, like you say, I started in 2021, I had my first paper published last year, and I've got another one coming out this year, and I'm currently working on another piece of research as well. I kind of threw myself into research, so I was really delighted to be talking about it. And I'm very keen on spreading the word of my findings. But then when we started talking, and others have talked to me as well, about the process of research and why we should get into it as practitioners. And I think that sense of having just come off that webinar with David, when he talked about evidence-based practice, I thought, yeah, that's what we're doing here. You know, as practitioners, coaching is led by practice, not by theory. It's led by practitioners. We're ahead of the writing, the literature. And to bridge that gap between this is what we do and this is why we do it and this is how we experience it, if we can research that and write it up in a way that is essentially capturing practical wisdom, this is what happens in practice and this is how it relates to what people think coaching is and the emergence of the practice. I think it's super important that we demonstrate our professionalism and our theoretical underpinnings through our practice. So I think practitioners should be interested in research, should be interested in making sure that what they do is evidence-based. So I was delighted to come and talk about that, because that's what you and I do, I think, and that's what people who are practitioner researchers do. So I thought, great opportunity, and here I am, and I'm very pleased to be here.
Fantastic. Yes, the practitioner part of practitioner researcher, you can do research in different ways. And I think the unique thing about the way that you've done yours is that you have done it independently. So it hasn't been through an academic institution. And I wonder if you mind sharing a bit about that journey and how you actually got that going.
Yeah, absolutely. So my research was on coaching supervision. When I trained to be a supervisor, I kind of had a hunch. You know, one of the big questions we were all asking ourselves was, what's the difference between coaching and supervision? And in some ways, it's still a bit of an unanswered question in many people's minds. I think coaches are unclear about it. I think supervisors are a bit more clear about it. And the working together, it becomes apparent what supervision is. But I had this hunch when I was doing my training, which was in 2019, and I launched my practice in 2020, just before lockdowns. Thankfully, I decided to launch purely online. So I was all set up, ready to go with my online supervision offer. And it's growing nicely, in the time since then. So I'm quite pleased with that. Now, I started practicing using my hunch. This is what I think supervision is. So let's try it out. Let's see if that's what coaches want from supervision, and see how I deliver my supervision and whether it marries up. I think it does. I've probably worked with about 40 coaches now in supervision, both in groups and individual. But what I wanted to do was evidence that. It's fine having a hunch and an opinion, like I said, David Clutterbuck had talked about, but to evidence it with proper research. And yes, it's academic research in the sense of it's pracademic research, if you will, but it's practitioner-led, but published with rigor, peer-reviewed, in a peer-reviewed journal. My thought was that was important to get to that point and have that. So this thought that I had, first thing I did was I reached out to a few folk, because I know nothing about getting published, nothing about doing research to that level of rigor, kind of PhD standard research. And I haven't got a PhD. I do have a master's degree, actually not in coaching, in organisation development. So I'm not scared of academic writing, but I'm certainly not known for my writing, and I'm not an academic in the sense of I don't have a PhD. But I do know a few folks. So I reached out to a few people who I thought might be able to help. Emeritus Professor Bob Garvey, who people may well know and come across his writing, had taught me to be a mentor when I had a corporate job, and had been one of the tutors on my MSc in organisation development. So I reached out to him and talked about what it would take to get published. And he very kindly offered to support me in giving a bit of guidance, a bit of academic mentoring, if you will, or supervision even, you might call it, and help me through. Without that, I don't know how I would have done it without people like that. I also reached out to Michelle Lucas, who's a coaching supervisor. People may know her book, 101 Coaching Supervision Techniques, etc. And she gave me some really practical guidance on, right from the practitioner's perspective. She said, don't try and be academic, right from the practitioner's perspective. Yes, do it with rigor, but really it's about the lived experience in the field. And if you're right from that perspective, then you're doing practitioner research. So that kind of got me started, talking to a couple of people that knew what they were doing, and then really making it my own after that. I did it my way. I picked the research method and got stuck in. And very gracious continued help from Bob throughout, where he helped me review things and put me back on the straight path when I'd slipped off it, following research methods and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so you had a hunch, probably from being a curious coach and a coach supervisor, and you experimented with that hunch in your own practice, and then started to question, how do I actually make this a bit more robust in terms of building the evidence? Reached out to some people, Bob Garvey was there, and then it kind of went from there by the sounds of it.
That's right, yeah. And there's a lot of pitfalls along the way. It's very easy to get knocked off track, I think. So the super important thing for me, the lessons learned, I guess, were knowing why I was doing it, knowing who I was, and knowing what I was trying to do, and then how I was going to do it. I think those are the 4 questions that really need to answer.
So let me go straight. So we're saying what it was you wanted to do, who you were while you were doing it, why you were doing it, and where it was going. So they were the 4 pins that kept you going. And it's interesting because some of these points are coming up through these conversations that I've been having, particularly this one about know why you're doing it, because then there's an end, not an end, because that's not quite right, but that your intention, you're still holding on to the intention of what you're doing it for, why you're doing it, where you want it to go. That's an interesting one, actually. Where do you see your papers? Where do you want this research to be used?
The why for me, the why am I doing this, was this sense, this hunch of, I think this is what we do in supervision. Because my research is all about interventions. It's all about how supervisors choose their interventions and how intentional they are in choosing them to meet the needs of their supervisee and the functions of supervision, if you will. Yeah? And there's not much evidence out there around the link between all of those things. So first and foremost, I was trying to validate my hunch. Now, on the face of it, that sounds like a kind of hypothesis that needs testing, and therefore it's sort of positivist research, but it wasn't. And this was where talking to people really helped me in getting some guidance, because I thought, well, I could come up with a generalized framework for choosing supervision interventions. Wouldn't that be fantastic? And everyone, Bob and others, said, no, you can't do that because you're doing qualitative analysis, you're doing qualitative research. So you're going to interview practitioners. And what I did in my first paper was interview both supervisor and supervisee. And actually supervisee data on supervision is very rare. Most of the papers written are on discussing with supervisors. So this did both. I actually got dyads of supervisor and supervisee to explore their experience of supervision. And exploring that experience created an insight into the phenomenology, the experience of being supervised and supervising. And by looking for the themes in that, I drew out, this is what it looks like is happening. And on the one hand, it kind of validated some of the thoughts of my hunch. It didn't fully validate them, but it gave a rich description of this is what happens. And then it culminated in a heuristic of, which is a bit like a sort of emerging framework, very tentative idea of it looks like this sort of thing is happening. Now, the reason I did that, first and foremost, was to inform my own practice. Was I on the right lines? Was my hunch reasonable or not? And actually, it shifted during the research because there were certain words I was using that had nuances to them that weren't quite right. And through the research, that was refined by people saying, oh, it's not really like that, it's more like this. And of course, I sat and reflected on that for weeks and weeks and weeks and had epiphanies in the middle of the night. My research journal sitting on the side of my bedside, I would leap out of bed and write down some crazy epiphany in the middle of the night and then fall fast asleep again, having churned it all night in my head. But what it meant was that my practice has improved as a result. And I think part of my why was, how can I find out more about this thing called supervision? How can I generate some practical wisdom from out in the field that says, yeah, this is what is happening here for my own use? And by documenting it in a way that's accessible through an open access journal means it's out there for, hey, this might be useful to you too. Yeah. So whilst it's not, I can't create a generalized theory of supervision because that would take an enormous quantitative piece to consider every possible scenario and so on and so forth. What I can do is say it works for me, it works for these other supervisors. This is what we're finding out. Perhaps it might be helpful to others. And that's the why, is if we can explain how supervisors choose their interventions, then maybe that's helpful for other people who are trying to understand supervision, either what they want from it, because they want to train in it, because they are training in it, and then how to actually put that into practice and reflective practice of learning more about doing it for real, Long-winded answer, sorry.
No. There's so much richness in there, and my brain's trying to cling on to the little bits and pieces, because I think there's also some really useful terminology in there that you used and could be useful for people listening if they're looking at papers. So you used the word phenomena and was explaining that, if I understood correctly, as an experience. So what's actually happened here, and analysing those experiences, which fits into qualitative research. And you also mentioned the word heuristic, which I think you were saying is kind of an example of how something might be, if I've got that correctly. Because I know sometimes you'll pick up a research paper and it'll have these terms in it, and then it doesn't actually make sense because you're not sure what that's explaining. So I thought it was just worth picking those bits up.
Yeah, the heuristic's an interesting one, actually, if I may, because I thought, well, I'll draw this. I'm very visual. I like models. I like frameworks and that sort of thing. So I was saying this is a framework. So I'm showing it to my academic supervisor, and he's sort of saying it's a heuristic. And I thought, well, what's that? He said, well, it's not proven. It's not a framework. It's not a model, because you can't say this is the model for. But what it is it captures the essence of what you've discovered and presents it in a schematic sort of way. So it's a kind of emerging framework, if you will. My second research piece has turned that into a framework, because we've done another research method that refines it by interviewing successive research partners, using the initial concept, which was based on the heuristic, and has refined that into a model that's kind of settled down. That's a research method called conceptual encounter, where you take a model that's part research-led created and part researcher created. So you can put hunches and ideas into there and then go and test them with people. And your research partners will feed back and say, yeah, it kind of works in this scenario. It doesn't really work over here. Or what about this? Have you thought about that? And you take it away and refine it. And then you take the refined model to the next research partner. So it's this iterative cycle of interview, feedback, reflection, deep reflection, really immersing yourself in the data that you've got from the interview, and then refining the model and taking the refined model to the next person, and keep going until it settles down. So my second research piece, which is coming out this August 24, was half a dozen of those. until it stopped moving. The last couple of people went, no, there's nothing else to add to this. It does what we think it does. And this is my experience accords with it. So, all right, well, it stopped moving then. It's publishable. It was a really interesting method.
Yeah. The thing that's standing out as being interesting listening to you is that no two people get the same concept presented to them until you get towards the end when the movement stops. And then you say, okay, well, we've got as much as we need. And I guess that only depends on the people that you approach at that point in time, because, of course, you're not going to take it to hundreds of people to test that. But I think it's fascinating that no two people ever see the same thing in that flow.
Yeah. And it might never settle down, of course. You see research papers using the conceptual encounter method where they've done 30, 40 iterations before it starts to settle. Because, in the first few, you might suddenly expand the scope of it and say, I haven't considered this, I haven't considered that. But as a researcher, you're the guardian of the concept. So you can say, all right, well, we'll exclude those bits then. We'll just focus on this part. And as long as your assumptions are clear and the potential applicability of it is clear, it can settle down either quickly or not quickly. And going into it, I had no idea how many people I would need to talk to before it made sense. Or it might never make sense. It might go, no, this was a total non-starter. We need to scrap this and start again.
And there's something else that's striking me in that when we first started talking, you said something along the lines of, I'm not an academic, I don't know anything about research. And here we are exploring all these different concepts and different methods and models. And you've clearly undertaken lots of interviews. And that links also to something you said about knowing who you are as you go through this process. So how has everything that you've learned fed into who you actually are, whether that's as a human, as a coach supervisor, some other role that you play in life?
What a question. Thank you. I'm a practitioner-researcher. I'm pretty clear on that now. And I'm a supervision practitioner-researcher. That's the main thrust of my business and my identity in a working context. I picked up supervision 4 or 5 years ago now, 2019, qualified 2020, launched the business. And it's now the majority of what I do. Lockdown meant that all my other work, I was an OD practitioner, an OD consultant, and all of that walked out the door on March 24th, 2020 or whatever it was. And all was left was online coaching and, for me, supervision, which grew nicely. And now that's all I do. I don't leave the house for anymore. So the desire to underpin my practice with evidence-based, research-based, led me into the research world. And I really didn't know anything about it. The first thing I did was buy a book called Doing Coaching Research by Elaine Cox and Peter Jackson. I don't know if you know that one. It was recently published. It was only published in 2020. And here I was in 2021 deciding to do some research. It was a really fresh piece, beautifully written piece of different methods and the ontological and epistemological positions that underpin them and all this kind of stuff.
Okay, we're going to need to clarify those words.
But that is the question of who you are. On the one hand, I'm not afraid of those words because I'd done my master's degree and I kind of knew what we were talking about, the nature of knowledge, the nature of being in the world, the positions that we take on knowledge and understanding and creation of knowledge. And I've lost my thread a little bit, but the sense of who I am. So I was a supervisor, first and foremost, wanting to underpin it. So I've done the research. And like you say, I'm using words here that 2-3 years ago, I had no idea. I'd never heard of interpretive phenomenological analysis or phronesis or conceptual encounter. And reading that book and then talking to Bob Garvey and others helped me kind of immerse myself in it. And I love it. I want to do more and more. If you answer the questions, why am I doing this? Who am I? What am I doing? And how am I going to do it? That sets you up for then when you in the hellish pit of analysing all this data, wrestling with the literature, sleepless nights, leaping out of bed with my epiphanies, all that stuff that could just knock you off track and you get swamped. You come back to, what am I doing again? Why am I doing it? What am I trying to do? How am I doing it? And it really keeps you grounded and focused and fulfilled ultimately. Ultimate fulfillment and learning of, we've done something here. It's got published. We got it through the peer review and got it into the journal. And the next one's coming out, and I'm working on a third piece now. I just want to do more and more of it. So I would right here, right now say I'm a coaching supervision practitioner-researcher.
Yeah. It's almost like you need to leave now so you can go and start some other project. Like, I'm holding you back. It is great. And there are so many different areas to continue that research. Thinking about, and I know obviously you'll have implemented your own research into your practice. Have you got any other examples of where you've taken some research and kind of converted it into what it practically means for you and then implemented it in to have impact with your supervision clients?
Yeah, definitely. There's a risk that some of that you read is opinion and not evidence-based. So, for example, I've mentioned already in Michelle Lucas's book, there's this very practical set of techniques, 101 techniques that she's published in a book about coaching supervision, right? And I read some of them and go, okay, it's just some of it's a bit like a coaching technique. So I'm kind of questioning, what makes this supervision? Which is that question I started with in the first place. What's the difference between coaching and supervision? But then as I did the research, I would find techniques that were quite clearly well researched and were people's PhDs or books that had been written, published, and are quite well known in supervision circles, but I hadn't come across yet. Right? And some people who are listening to this who are coaching supervisors will go, why didn't you cover that? How didn't you cover that in your training? But we didn't, right? So Heron's 6 category interventions. I don't know if you know this one, Sheila. She's nodding. She's nodding. People who are listening, she's nodding. Yes. So I hadn't come across Heron's 6 categories of intervention. Now, clearly I'm researching coaching interventions, so I come across his thesis, his PhD thesis online, and various books as well that he's written. So I went through some of that, and of course, I then spot it in Michelle's book. So I'm starting to see things in the book that I know are evidence-based, and they have found their way into my practice. So I would say Heron is one of those. For example, that I might not have spotted in the book, I might not have used, I might not know that much about, but I've certainly experimented with it with my supervisees, particularly in group supervision.
It's a really good way to come at it from whether it's in several places or just in one place, depending on who's been using it and testing it and exploring it. So I think that's a great support tip for people listening to think about, where is this being used already, this evidence, this research? Thanks for sharing that.
And because with my research hat, I can critique it as well and see the gaps in it and see and question whether it's applicable to coaching supervision or how applicable it is to coaching supervision. Because, of course, that is a piece of research based on therapeutic supervision. I have a kind of another hunch, that not everything in therapeutic supervision can be lifted and dropped into coaching supervision. So I think one of the tricks in research, and I'd be interested in your perspective on this as well, Sheila, is on the one hand, you could read all the literature and kind of affirm it all and go, yeah, it's fine. Yeah, this is all right. This is all correct. Yeah. Or we could just knock it all down and say there's gaps in this, there's a problem. The trick for me has been finding the balance between just knocking everything or just affirming everything and using your judgment and the evidence that you're gaining to say, actually, there is a gap here. That doesn't work in all situations. How can we fill that gap with research? Does that resonate with your research?
Yes, I'm trying to think. Because just as an example, when I first started the research, I had to look for a definition for resilience because I'm looking at the impact of coaching on resilience. And the first problem that you stumble across is that there is no universal definition. So then I have to find the ones that do exist and decide, well, which one am I going to use for this? And that then you could fall into the pitfall of going away to research that. Oh, well, I want to come up with a universal definition then. And before you know it, you've got a whole other research project. But you have to look at the papers, see where they're coming from, see what evidence is behind them and what gaps. And the one I ended up most liking was Bonanno. And I'm not going to be able to quote the actual definition, but the essence of it was how we can't really measure someone's resilience until they've been through a traumatic event and come out the other side. And it's how they emerge on the other side of it. And equally, there's no time frame to that because you can't say, oh, well, if they're out within 2 weeks, they're okay, because it doesn't work like that. It may take time, but it's where you kind of emerge back to. So I know I've slightly digressed, but I really resonate with that you have to collect, see what you've got, see what's missing. Yeah, and avoid the temptation to go off researching things on your way to the project itself. So thanks for posing that.
That could lead you down a qualitative review, a qualitative piece of work that looks at the experience of the phenomenology of resilience. Rather than any theoretical definitions, it's more about the lived experience of people who've been through it. So you pick your research methods to fit your topic and your question that you're holding.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, actually, the difference between qualitative and quantitative, because to do quantitative research, you need to have surveys, questionnaires that are reliable and valid and already tested. Now, there may not be a measure that measures what you want to measure. So then part of your study could end up being getting a measure in place. So I've had to use the best one that suits what I want to measure, even though it's not measuring exactly what I want to look at. And it's already making me think, well, I know I want to do future qualitative studies based on what I find in the quantitative, because I've got more questions already and I haven't even seen the full data yet. What's your sort of view between qualitative and quantitative?
One of the unanswered questions I put in my second paper here that's coming out this August is that some of the findings in the qualitative study might yield in questions that could be suitable for larger quantitative studies. I think it can go both ways. And, a well-researched topic would require both, I think. And whilst coaching lends itself to qualitative because it's about experience, there's absolutely a place for quantitative studies. I'm kind of a constructivist mindset that says we create the world as we go along, and that leads you down qualitative, interpretive, phenomenological type approaches of understanding experience, distilling it into essential meaning and sharing that meaning to say, hey, this might be useful. This is what I think this stuff is. But then you go, well, is it that? Is it that? And if a well-researched topic would then take those concepts and go and test them more empirically with harder data to say, what are the outcomes from this? What are the things that happen? How many times do they happen? How frequent does this occur? And you start to quantify some of those experiences with some harder data.
It's funny, I'm listening here and all these different words are coming in and I'm thinking, I'm just about clinging onto this conversation and understanding what we're talking about. But it is about essentially getting curious and finding a way to answer those questions. And so some of this terminology is just how we do it. And as you've already mentioned the book that, if you want to do research, get a look at the different types of methodology that there are and make sense of the language. Because even if you don't want to directly lead research yourself, then knowing the different types will help you understand when you are reading the papers as to how to interpret it in terms of whether it's generalizable or whether it was an experience that needs further investigation.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you have a question that you want answering, it might be that just going and reading around the subject will give you the answer that you're looking for, and you don't need to undertake a piece of research. The research is actually reviewing the research that's out there. And curiously, one of the very first papers I read when I was undertaking my supervision research was a paper entitled A Comprehensive Review of Coaching Supervision Literature. Well, that's a great place to start, right? Because someone's already read everything that's out there. I can read that and get some ideas about which elements of that I want to now pursue a bit further and are relevant to my question.
Yeah, exactly. In those papers, there's a couple of other titles that you might find, which would be a systematic literature review, where someone has systematically picked up all the literature and reviewed it. But also, I think it's called a meta-analysis, where taking a look at all the studies in a particular field and then pull that all together. So exactly as you say, if you've got a question about something, someone might have already done that. And there will always be a list of references. So then you can go dig about in the references for that paper if you want to get into the detail of it.
And oftentimes those papers do have questions at the end, typically questions at the end saying there's further research needed in these certain areas within this, or this area is under-researched, or all we've found is 2 papers on this particular element of it. And you kind of go, oh, that's interesting. That is something I'm interested in. Maybe I could do a bit of research in that area.
I'm hearing like your energy for the research in coach supervision. So this question might be a bit left field, but if all the research had been done in coach supervision, where would you turn your attention?
Ooh, that's interesting, isn't it? Well, given I've done some of it, I guess I would probably, my gut feel says turn it into a book, or it can't all be done, can it? In one sense, all the models, conceptual frameworks, heuristics, ideas, opinions, all that stuff that's out there and has been done. So, all right, well, let's just evidence it a bit further then. What about a case book? What about going and interviewing practitioners to validate again, or to bring some real life examples into, and you can do that anonymously as well, or we can do kind of amalgam case studies where you bring different elements of real examples together as if it was one case, so that it's even harder to unpick who it might have been or who was involved or whatever. Bringing to life some of the research and some of the theories that are emerging from the research through case study, I think, is an area that we would do more in. And you could never be exhausted because practice outpaces theory, practice outpaces research in our world, in coaching and mentoring and coach supervision. So do long range case studies. Supervision lends itself to, there was a wonderful book last year by Adamson and Brengan about a 15-year supervisory relationship and how it turned from transactional to relational over the duration. And that's essentially a longitudinal case study, right? And that's one book about one relationship. So research could never end. I think we would write books, and I think we would write case books, field notes, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I like the idea of that, because that really gets into what's really going on when you're just focusing on an individual. So, this conversation is so delicious. I want to make sure that there's nothing still on your mind that you were hoping we were going to speak about and we just haven't got to yet.
It's a great question. I think I've talked about most things. There was one thing when you asked me to think about what we were going to talk about, I came across, it might be a bit flippant, but I came across a quote from an American comedian who I've never heard of called Stephen Wright. His view on research is as follows, and I just want to say this. To steal ideas from one person is plagiarism, but to steal from many is research.
Ooh, I like that we're ending on a quote. Because when people are quite protective over things, like worried that someone's going to steal it, there's something about that's the greatest form of flattery if someone wants to steal your ideas. So, yeah, collecting them is research. Like, we will ponder that. We'll make sure we get that in the notes as well.
He also goes on to say that your conclusion is when you get tired of thinking.
Yeah. Tired of thinking or tired of collecting, one way or the other. Oh, thank you so much for giving time to join us in conversation. Where can people find you if they would like to hear more?
You can find me on my website or on LinkedIn. You can find me as Jeremy J. Lewis on LinkedIn, for example. And my website for my supervision practice is growthecoach.com.
Fabulous. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you, Sheela.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and to make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub, enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.